Ava Mitchell walked into Titan Corp, hoping for a chance, but she was laughed out of the room. Now she's back. But this time, she isn't asking for a job. She's taking the company. And the man who rejected her, he's about to lose everything. Will he fight back, or is this the end of his empire? Let's dive into this gripping tale of revenge, power, and the ultimate takeover. Years ago, Ava Mitchell stood outside the towering glass skyscraper of Titan Corp, adjusting the cuffs of her navy blue blazer. The morning sun reflected off the polished steel logo above the entrance, a symbol of power and prestige in the world of finance. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped through the revolving doors. Inside, the lobby buzzed with sharp-dressed professionals clutching briefcases and speaking in hushed, urgent tones. This was more than just an interview. It was the next step toward everything she had worked for, earning her Ivy League degree, gaining hands-on experience, mastering the markets. She had sacrificed too much for nerves to get in her way now. At the receptionist desk, a well-manicured woman glanced up. "Name, Ava Mitchell. I have a 10 o'clock interview with Mr. Langston." The receptionist gave a brief nod before directing her to the executive floor. Ava stepped into the elevator, her heartbeat steady, her mind sharp. The conference room was sleek and impersonal, floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the Manhattan skyline, a massive table more suited for war strategies than business discussions. Then the door opened, and in walked Richard Langston. He was exactly as she had imagined, gray-haired, impeccably tailored, exuding an arrogance masked as authority. Behind him trailed two senior executives, both middle-aged men who barely acknowledged her as they took their seats. Richard skimmed through her resume with the disinterest of a man reading a grocery list. "You have an impressive education," he said finally, not looking up. "Harvard, top of your class." "Yes," Ava replied, keeping her tone professional. "I also have 6 years of industry experience." Richard waved a hand dismissively. "With small firms, yes, but Titan Corp operates on a different level. We require people with high-level, long-term exposure to major accounts." Ava knew exactly where this was going. She had experience. She had results. What she lacked were the right connections, the unspoken rule of hiring in firms like this. "I understand," she said, keeping her expression neutral, "but my work has shown I can compete with the best in the industry. If given the opportunity, I'm confident I can bring fresh strategies that would." Richard leaned back in his chair, finally meeting her gaze with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "You seem driven," he said, as if choosing his words carefully, "but you're just not the right fit for Titan Corporation. We're looking for someone with a certain level of experience." She heard what he wasn't saying. She wasn't one of them. She hadn't been born into their world, hadn't attended their private clubs, didn't have an uncle who played golf with the board members. Still, she held her ground. "Mr. Langston, if you're rejecting me based on my background rather than my qualifications, then I believe Titan Corp is missing out on." Richard sighed, closing the folder. "We appreciate your interest, Ms. Mitchell, but we've decided to move forward with other candidates." The meeting was over before it even began. Ava clenched her jaw but refused to let them see her disappointment. She rose from her chair and extended a hand, not because she expected him to shake it, but because she wanted him to remember that she wasn't afraid to stand tall. Richard barely glanced at her before nodding to the door. As she walked out of the building, she didn't feel defeated. She felt something else. Determined. If they thought she wasn't the right fit now, she would make sure that one day they wouldn't have a choice but to recognize her. Titan Corp had just underestimated the wrong woman, and soon they'd regret it. Ava Mitchell sat in a quiet cafe, her untouched coffee growing cold as she replayed the interview in her mind. Lack of experience, Richard Langston had said, his voice dripping with condescension. It wasn't about experience. It never was. She had graduated at the top of her class. She had worked tirelessly, earning a reputation as one of the most promising financial minds in the industry. But none of that had mattered to Langston. He had dismissed her before she even had a chance to prove herself. Ava clenched her fists. She refused to let one man's arrogance define her future. Still brooding over Titan Corp, she looked up to see James Holloway, her longtime mentor and former Wall Street powerhouse, sliding into the seat across from her. James had seen the industry from the inside, its ugly truths, its unspoken rules. "You were right," Ava admitted. "They were never going to hire me." James smirked. "Of course I was right. The game was rigged before you even walked through the door." Ava exhaled sharply. "Then what now? Keep applying to firms that will never give me a real shot?" James leaned in, his voice steady. "No, you start your own." Ava blinked. "My own firm? Why not?" James said with a shrug. "You have the brains, the skill, and the drive. All you need is capital and the right strategy." Ava scoffed. "Do you have any idea how impossible that sounds? Titan Corp has been around for decades. They have billions in assets. I don't even have an office." James leaned back, a knowing smile on his face. "You think Titan Corp started as a billion-dollar firm?" "No. Richard Langston's father built it and handed it to him on a silver platter. He's never had to fight for anything in his life." Ava knew he was right, and that fueled her anger. Langston had opportunity handed to him while she had to prove her worth at every step. step. James took out a small notebook, scribbled something down, and slid it across the table. What's this? Ava asked. Contacts, James said simply. Investors, small business owners, people willing to bet on the right mind if you can convince them. You get a few early wins, build a track record, and the bigger clients will come. Ava hesitated. The idea was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. If she built her own firm, she would never have to beg for a seat at someone else's table. She looked at James, her resolve hardening. I'm doing it. James grinned. That's my girl. Ava took the notebook, feeling a fire ignite within her. Titan Corp had rejected her, but soon they'd regret it. Ava sat in the small, dimly lit office she had just leased, a far cry from the glass skyscraper of Titan Corporation. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, and the only sound was the hum of an outdated desktop computer she had borrowed. This wasn't where she had imagined herself, but it was where she would start. She took a deep breath and looked over at her first hire, Elena Carter, a sharp-minded analyst who had also been shut out by firms that valued legacy names over talent. We're going to change the game, Ava said, her voice steady. Elena smirked. Let's just get a client first. Ava had talent, vision, and a drive that few could match, but she lacked what Wall Street valued most, connections. The first week, she cold called dozens of investors, pitching her firm, Mitchell Capital. One rejection after another. Never heard of you. I'm sticking with Titan Corporation. You don't have enough experience. Ava gritted her teeth. She had heard that before. Richard Langston's words echoed in her mind. Lack of experience. That phrase had kept so many people like her from breaking through. Fine, she thought. If they won't listen, I'll make them listen. One evening, after another exhausting day, Ava sat in a coffee shop scrolling through her phone when she overheard a conversation. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit was complaining about how his investments were failing due to outdated strategies. Ava hesitated for only a second before approaching his table. Excuse me, I couldn't help but hear, she said with a polite but confident smile. I might have a solution for you. The man, David Kessler, raised an eyebrow. And who are you? Ava met his gaze without flinching. Ava Mitchell. I run Mitchell Capital. Never heard of it. Yet, Ava said, give me 10 minutes. If I don't impress you, I'll walk away. David leaned back, intrigued. Ava grabbed a napkin and started breaking down his portfolio's flaws. His firm was relying on outdated, slow-growth methods. She outlined a bold strategy, one built on AI-driven analytics and risk-adjusted investments. By the time she finished, David was no longer dismissive. He was leaning in, nodding. How much are you managing right now? He asked. Ava took a steady breath. We're in early stages, but you be our priority client. David studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he extended his hand. You've got guts. I'll start you off with $5 million. Let's see what you can do. Ava shook his hand, barely containing her excitement. This was it, the beginning. With David's backing, Mitchell Capital had credibility. More clients followed, drawn in by Ava's sharp insights and fearless approach. Meanwhile, across the city, Titan Corp was slipping, failing to adapt to a rapidly changing market. Ava had once walked into Richard Langston's office hoping for an opportunity. Now, she was building something that would one day crush him, and soon he would realize it. Richard Langston stood in his glass-walled office, gazing over the Manhattan skyline. From up here, the city felt like it belonged to him. Power, prestige, and control were things he had always taken for granted. Titan Corp had ruled Wall Street for decades. No upstart firm could ever threaten that. At least, that's what he thought. Sir, we lost another client. Titan Corp's CFO, David Calloway, muttered, shifting nervously in his chair. Richard's head snapped toward him. Ooh, Trenton Holdings. They're moving their assets to Mitchell Capital. Richard stiffened. That name again. Mitchell Capital. A small firm. Insignificant. Or at least, that's what he had assumed. But over the past 6 months, Titan Corp had lost 3 major accounts, all to Ava Mitchell. He had dismissed her once, rejected her without a second thought. Now, her firm was climbing fast, and Titan Corp was beginning to fall. Across town, in a sleek but modest office, Ava sat at a conference table with her growing team. Trenton Holdings just signed on. Her financial strategist, Daniel Carter, announced with a grin. Ava allowed herself a small smile. Good, but we don't stop here. Who's next? She pulled up Titan Corp's client list, scanning for weaknesses. Cracks were forming in Richard Langston's empire. We don't just want their clients, she said, her voice razor sharp. We want their reputation. Mitchell Capital wasn't just another firm. It was a movement. They weren't shackled by outdated systems like Titan Corporation. They adapted. They innovated. And most importantly, they listened. Ava never forgot what it felt like to be dismissed. Now she was making sure no one else was overlooked for their background, connections, or identity. And Wall Street was starting to notice. Back at Titan Corp, panic was setting in. Richard stormed into a board meeting, his executives sitting stiffly, avoiding his gaze. Our quarterly numbers are down 12%. Investor confidence is shaken. The press is picking up on the losses. The voices blurred together. But one thing was clear. Titan Corp was bleeding. Richard slammed his fist on the table. This company has been around for decades. We've survived worse. We'll survive this." But even as he said it, a sliver of doubt crept in. Because this time, the threat wasn't market trends or bad investments. It was a woman he had underestimated, and she was coming for everything he had. Ava Mitchell sat in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of Mitchell Capital, eyes fixed on the numbers flashing across the monitor. They had just landed their biggest deal yet, one that should have gone to Titan Corp. The room buzzed with quiet celebration, team exchanging proud smiles. But Ava remained still, her fingers steepled under her chin. This was just the beginning. Did Titan even put up a fight for this contract? Her voice was calm, razor sharp. Lena Carter, her operations manager, nodded. They tried, but their offer was outdated. The client wanted flexibility and innovation. And, well, that's exactly what we gave them. Ava exhaled slowly, a smile tugging at her lips. Titan Corp had dismissed her, claiming she wasn't ready. Now, they were losing to her. Across the city, Richard Langston paced his office, fingers gripping a tumbler of whiskey. The once unshakable walls of Titan Corp now echoed with doubt. "Sir, we lost the Blackstone portfolio to Mitchell Capital," one of his executives admitted, shifting uncomfortably. Richard scoffed. "Mitchell Capital? That upstart firm? Who the hell even runs it?" Silence. Then the executive cleared his throat. "Ava Mitchell." Richard's hand froze midair. Ava Mitchell. The name clawed at his memory. He remembered her now. The woman he'd rejected without a second thought. She had walked into his office, prepared and ambitious, only for him to brush her off like she was nothing. And now, she was taking everything that should have belonged to him. His grip tightened around the glass before he slammed it onto his desk. "This is just a fluke," Richard growled. "She got lucky. One doesn't make her a threat." But for the first time in his career, Richard Langston felt something unfamiliar. Fear. That night, Ava stood by the window of her penthouse office, looking down at the glittering skyline. The city was hers for the taking. She turned to Lena. "Titan Corp is vulnerable." Lena's eyes gleamed with understanding. "You want more." Ava's smile sharpened. "I want everything. And this was only the beginning." Richard Langston sat in his penthouse office, staring at the quarterly financial reports with a deepening scowl. Red. Everything was in the red. The numbers didn't lie. Titan Corp was bleeding, and the board was growing restless. His assistant, Daniel, hesitated at the door before stepping in. "Sir, we just lost another client. Crestview Investments pulled out." Richard's fingers tightened around his Mont-Blanc pen. "They've been with us for a decade," he said, his voice tight. "Where the hell did they go?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Mitchell Capital. That name again. That damn name. It was everywhere now, creeping into Titan Corp's client list like a virus. Investors were pulling their money, shifting their portfolios to an upstart firm led by the same woman he had dismissed 2 years ago. The woman he told wasn't a good fit. Richard scoffed. It had to be luck, a fluke. She had made a few bold plays, and investors were infatuated with her fresh, modern approach. But she couldn't possibly keep up with Titan Corp. At least, that's what he told himself. Then came the final blow. "Sir," Daniel hesitated before placing an envelope on his desk. "This is from the board." Richard tore it open, his stomach tightening. A formal review of his leadership. A meeting had been scheduled. Shareholders were losing confidence. If Titan Corp's downward spiral continued, they'd be looking for someone else to take control. He clenched his jaw. Not a chance. Ava Mitchell sat at the head of her glass conference table, surrounded by her team. On the screen behind her, Titan Corp's financial struggles were laid out in brutal clarity. "They're barely holding on," her CFO, Lisa, said. "At this rate, Titan will be looking for outside investors to keep themselves afloat." Ava leaned back in her chair, tapping her nails on the table. This wasn't just business. This was personal. 2 years ago, Richard Langston had looked her in the eye and told her she wasn't good enough. Now, she was watching his empire crumble under the weight of his own arrogance. But not yet. She needed to wait. When Titan Corp was truly on its knees, desperate for survival, that's when she'd make her move. She wasn't just going to beat them. She was going to own them. And when that day came, Richard Langston would have no choice but to watch her take everything. The breaking point was here. Richard Langston sat in his corner office, staring at the latest financial reports. Titan Corp was hemorrhaging. Clients had lost confidence. Investors were backing out, and the stock had taken a nosedive. For the first time in years, a sliver of fear crept into his chest. He had built this empire on power, connections, and a strict hiring policy that kept his circle exclusive. Now, that empire was crumbling beneath him, but he still didn't know who was orchestrating his downfall. Across the city, in a sleek modern office, Ava Mitchell leaned back in her chair, watching Titan Corp's stock price drop. "This is it," she murmured, fingers tapping the desk. Her team had been working silently, strategically, acquiring Titan Corp's stock piece by piece. She had waited for this moment, when Titan was weak, vulnerable, and desperate. Now it was time. James Holloway, her mentor, sat across from her, a knowing smirk on his face. "Are you ready for this, Ava?" She met his gaze, unwavering. "I've been ready since the day he turned me away." James chuckled. "Then let's make it official." Ava picked up the phone. "Place the bid." did. Within hours, the financial world erupted. A mystery investor had acquired a controlling stake in Titan Corp. Richard Langston was no longer in charge, and soon he would find out exactly who had taken his place. The next morning, Richard stormed into a crisis meeting, his face red with fury. His legal team, shareholders, and board members sat stiffly, eyes darting between each other. "Who the hell is behind this hostile takeover?" he barked. A young analyst nervously slid a folder across the table. "Sir, the investor behind the acquisition, it's Mitchell Capital." Richard froze. His heart slammed against his ribs. Mitchell? No, it couldn't be. He snatched the file and flipped it open, and there, printed in bold letters, was the name he had once dismissed without a second thought. Ava Mitchell, the woman he had rejected, the woman he had humiliated, the woman who now owned his company. Later that evening, as the sun set over New York City, Ava stepped into Titan Corp's headquarters. She walked past the same reception desk where, years ago, she had once sat nervously, hoping for a chance. Now, she owned everything. Her heels clicked against the marble floors as she made her way to the boardroom. Richard was waiting. His face was pale, furious, and disbelieving. Ava set her bag down and folded her arms. "I believe you once told me I lacked experience." Richard clenched his jaw. A slow, triumphant smile spread across Ava's face. "Let's talk about your severance package." Richard Langston sat at the head of the gleaming mahogany conference table in Titan Corp's boardroom, his fingers clasped tightly together. He had built this company from the ground up, crushed competitors, and outlasted economic downturns. Yet, for the first time in his career, he wasn't in control. Across from him sat Ava Mitchell, the woman he had dismissed without a second thought, the woman he told lacked experience. Now she was staring him down, not as a job candidate, but as the owner of Titan Corp. The silence in the room was suffocating. The board members, once Richard's allies, watched uncomfortably, aware that their future no longer rested in his hands. Ava leaned back in her chair, exuding effortless confidence. She had waited years for this moment. "I assume you've read over the terms of my acquisition?" Her voice was smooth, professional, unyielding. Richard's jaw tightened. He had read them, and he hated every word. Titan Corp was drowning in financial losses. Shareholders had lost faith. Clients were jumping ship. The only option left was to sell, and Ava Mitchell had been the highest bidder. He forced a smirk. "You're overpaying for a sinking ship." Ava's lips curved into a knowing smile. "That's the difference between you and me, Richard. You see a sinking ship. I see a company in need of new leadership." The tension in the room thickened. The board members shifted uncomfortably. They all knew the truth. Richard had run Titan Corp into the ground. Mitchell Capital had outperformed them in half the time. Richard scoffed. "You think you can run this company better than me?" Ava didn't hesitate. "I know I can." She leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "The same company you told me I wasn't qualified for. The same position you denied me." She smiled. "I built my own empire when you shut the door in my face. And now I'm here, not asking for a job, but taking the company out of your hands." A flicker of something crossed Richard's face. Regret? Panic? He masked it quickly, with arrogance. "You have no idea what it takes to run a company of this scale." Ava chuckled softly. "Funny, because I already own one. And unlike you, I actually adapt." Richard's smirk faltered. He knew he was losing. One of the board members cleared his throat. "Mr. Langston, the votes have been counted. Ms. Mitchell now holds a majority stake in Titan Corporation. The transition is effective immediately." Silence. Richard's face turned pale. "This is a mistake." Ava stood, gathering the signed contracts. "No, Richard, the mistake was underestimating me." She walked toward the door, then paused. This was the moment she had waited for. Turning back, she met his eyes one last time. "You should have hired me when you had the chance." And with that, Ava Mitchell walked out, not as an employee, but as the new owner of Titan Corp. The boardroom was silent. The deal was done. The ink was dry. Titan Corp was no longer Richard Langston's empire. It belonged to Ava Mitchell. Richard sat stiffly at the head of the long, polished table. The confidence that once defined him was gone, replaced with something foreign, irrelevance. Ava, poised and commanding in a sharp navy suit, stood at the opposite end. The very boardroom that had dismissed her now hung on to her every word. She turned to the executives, her voice steady. "There are going to be some changes." A few of Richard's old allies shifted uncomfortably. They had spent years backing him, believing in his outdated methods. Now, they were at the mercy of the woman he refused to hire. And Ava Mitchell wasn't here to play by his rules. Richard cleared his throat, grasping at whatever pride he had left. "You'll regret this, Mitchell. Titan Corp isn't some startup you can run on idealism." Ava smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just certainty. The kind of smile that said she had already won. "You mean the same idealism that just bought out your failing company?" Her voice was cool, effortless. Silence. Even Richard had no comeback. Ava's first order of business? A full-scale restructuring. The exclusionary hiring policies that had kept people like her out? Gone. The old boys club that controlled promotions? Dismantled. The stale investment strategies that had dragged Titan Corp into decline? Replaced with innovation. She brought in fresh fresh talent, diverse, hungry, and brilliant. People who had been overlooked, just like she once was. Within 6 months, Titan Corp was no longer the failing relic Richard had left behind. It was thriving. The media called it the ultimate power move. The woman once denied an opportunity had taken everything. And Richard Langston, he faded into irrelevance. Investors had lost faith. No firm wanted a CEO whose own company had crumbled under his leadership. One evening, Ava sat in her new office, the one that had once belonged to Richard. She ran her fingers over the sleek mahogany desk, remembering the last time she had been in this building. That day, she had walked out humiliated. Now, she owned everything. Ava leaned back in her chair, exhaled, and smiled. She had won.